Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
Jeffrey Kripal, welcome back to the New School at Commonweal.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are continuing our series of conversations on your 13 books. This time, we are discussing Authors of the Impossible, the Paranormal, and the Sacred.
Yeah.
Jeff, you've said to me that this is your favorite text of your 13 books. What makes you say that?
Well, I think this is the one where the theory or the model really behind a lot of the books, maybe all of them, it comes to the fore the most. This sort of reverence for writing as a paranormal practice, I think, comes out really pretty obviously in this book. And I wrote this, as I've also told you, I wrote this as an introduction and then just got out of hand. As it became its own thing.
Yeah, you wrote it as an introduction to mutants and mystics, which we'll talk about next time.
Right. And it's way too technical and nerdy for mutants and mystics, but it's definitely what I was thinking. It still is what I think.
So, in what years were you working on this book?
Well, okay, so these two books, by the way, were published just a year apart, and they come after the Esalen book, obviously. So I'm working on this, what I think is a single book, from '07 to 2010 or so, and then it splits into these two books, and becomes Authors of the Impossible, which I think is 2010 actually, and then Mutants and Mystics, which comes out in 2011. So the answer to your question is '07, '08, '09, somewhere in there. Yeah.
And by this time, of course, since you've written the Esalen book, which we talked about, and which is an extraordinary combination of a history of Esalen and the research work that you led there, but also it was a kind of cultural history of the left coast, if you want. And so by this time, you are completely steeped in Esalen culture.
Yes, absolutely. And not just steeped, but committed to it, on a kind of existential level. We've talked about this, but these books, these are not neutral, objective reports on some kind of political or social movement. They're existential whammies that I'm very much trying to not only express but be part of.
Which, as you say toward the end, is at a very fundamental level a rebalancing of the relationship between the Aristotelian and Platonic themes in Western culture and civilization, which from your perspective and from mine had over the last century had swung far too far toward the Aristotelian / materialist understanding and away from the Platonic / idealist understanding.
Yeah.
And you were not calling for, in any way, I think this is part of the strategic power, but also the truth power of your work. You were not calling in any sense to abandon the left brain Aristotelian materialist dimension, but rather a rebalancing to have them both integrated.
Yeah. Yeah, that's clearly the call or the for the message. And of course it's relevant today because we continuously hear that we shouldn't think about class, gender, sexuality, and race or the ecology. And of course we should, and we do. And those critical theories are all a part of the arsenal or the this toolbox, as it were. But so are these altered states. So are these experiences of enlightenment and transcendence, and it's all there. So I don't. I'm just trying to resist this idea that we're only doing one thing, only thinking with half of our brains, as it were.
Now, because this book is so important to you and so important to me, and you asked me in our correspondence about, I said to you, this book kind of completed my so-called flip, to use the language of your
Yeah.
book called The Flip,
Yeah.
into, although I have to say I've been half flipped for, decades.
Yeah.
But what your work has done for me is to take a whole set of uh, paranormal, psi phenomena, mystical experiences uh, that I had long inclined to believe were true
Yeah.
and made them actually true.
Yeah.
And so that flip from, gee, I'm inclined to believe that the soul survives death. I'm inclined to believe that intuitions come from somewhere. I am deeply inclined to believe that I have telepathic communications and so on. All the psi phenomena for which the materialist paradigm provides no support whatsoever. Uh, but there's a big difference between, being inclined to believe something and coming to a realization that, what, this is actually so. This is actually true. And then what happens is that a whole penumbra of other life experiences that I've had that I kind of set aside or didn't remember completely or whatever come trickling or sometimes flooding in to complete an entirely different perspective on my life and my sense of reality.
Mhm.
So anyway, you asked about what that flip meant for me, and interestingly, it isn't the so-called real deal of a complete experiential flip where I experience cosmic consciousness or whatever we want to call it. Although I have had tastes of that with cannabis and psychedelics long ago, also just life experiences. But it is much more an integration of jnana yoga, of a mental phenomenon that reconstitutes my experience of what is real and then organizes or reorganizes or integrates all the stuff I thought was probably real. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm like you, Michael. I think people want to sometimes imagine me as some kind of mage or mage. I just float from one impossible experience after another, or one fantastic thing after, and I don't actually. I live a very banal life in many ways, but I think it matters a great deal that we do the hard work and we create a model in which these things are not only possible, not only plausible, but obviously so. And so that's what this work is about. It's about that model. It's about creating a worldview, and it's not just about being nerdy or presenting another academic theory. It's like I mean I see people suffer all the time because they have these experiences and there's no way for them to fit in to their worldview. And I'm like, well, we need to change that worldview. We need to, and by changing it, I don't mean that our present worldview is wrong. I mean that it's inadequate, And so that's why this book to me is so important, because it not only shows definitively the inadequacy of our worldview, but it offers something positive, and it gives us a way of making the impossible possible in a really practical way that I think is just true. And I think you spoke to that in terms of, it's not just about entertaining these ideas or beliefs, but it's about realizing that they in fact actually happened. That's a function of worldview, or not a function of whether these things happen or not.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Because this book is so important to you and to me, what I'd like to do is to go through it.
Yeah.
And I won't, you start with a little piece on the magical politics of Bobby Kennedy, which we don't need to dwell on, but it's an introduction in which a friend of yours had an experience of sort of precognition of Kennedy's assassination, or a vivid vision of it, and then he discovered it was true, right?
Yeah. Right.
And and there was an interesting piece on that, which was that he had shaken hands with Kennedy, sometime before, and found his hand to have a strange feeling to it. And then you go into a riff about how in some traditions, if you are in physical contact with someone, your souls or whatever are forever connected.
Right. Bound.
And that's the introduction of the whole book, which serves, I guess, as a contemporary example of what you're going to be exploring.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's Adam Crabtree. And he's not just a friend, but he's a major writer and theorist of these things, So to me, it's like, again, it's this what we talked about with the Roads of Excess book. It's that major theorists have these experiences, and that they then inform their thought, and people are weird, Michael, and but in a really profound sense that drives their thinking and drives their ideas. And so that's why I wanted to begin with this story, because it's, to me, it's like symptomatic of a whole lot of other stories.
Then we really hit the ground running with an introductory chapter called Off the Page.
Mm-hmm.
And here you talk about restoring a lineage. And you talk about authors of the impossible, the paranormal as meaning, and the fantastic narrative of Western occulture, meaning occult culture, the paranormal as story. So let's start with restoring a lineage, because I think this is part of the reason this is so powerful for me. I am a traditionalist in the sense that I love old things, but more than that, I need to know the how can I put it, the philosophical academic thought lineage behind something. So what is so amazing to me, and I think it was amazing to you, is that as you researched this book, you ran into these thinkers that nobody referenced, nobody talked about for the most part, and yet they were major thinkers. And this lineage is what you are resurfacing and recreating, which, as a historian of religion, is a profoundly original piece of work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to do in the introduction, but also just to show that actually this lineage is already there. It's like obvious. And so why haven't we held this up? Why have we held things up that we've held, the academy has held all kinds of things up, but it has suppressed this lineage. And what I'm trying to do in this introduction is hold up people like Ernesto de Martino or Mircea Eliade or Frederick Myers, or you just show that this is or William James. This is an obvious part of Western culture as well.
Now, because your mentor at the University of Chicago was Wendy Doniger, who was a student of Mircea Eliade, and because Mircea Eliade totally got this and was an important part of the lineage, how aware were you when you were writing your PhD thesis, Callie's Child? How aware were you of this whole lineage and this whole Gestalt worldview that you then went through all this work and did everything up to Esalen and now this, that you filled out. In other words, how deeply were you into this already? And it was a kind of a realization of something that you had grokked from the start.
Well, I want to say not very. I was at Chicago, the div school in the late 80s and the early 90s, and things were shifting to a very, what I would call postmodern or local concern about what religion is. It was very much about difference and power, and you focus on the local tradition or the cultural tradition. You don't ask big questions about religion with a capital R, as I say. However, the people who had founded the discipline, certainly in which I existed, were interested in the big question, particularly Mircea Eliade. And now I didn't study with him. I didn't even meet him. He passed away the year I got there, but I did study and was mentored by his friend Wendy Doniger. And so I inhabited or inhaled Eliade really through Wendy, and she adored him, to be really blunt about it. And I could pick up a real deep friendship, and that meant a lot. That actually meant a lot to me. So I read a lot of him. And then Ioan Culianu was there in the late 80s and very early 90s, but was not Mircea Eliade in any way, but kind of was. He did think in those terms. But he wasn't my professor, Michael. I didn't study with Ioan, although that was certainly in the air or in the water, as it were. And Ioan, I later learned, was very much interested in science fiction and the paranormal and all these things that this book is about. But I didn't know that really at the time, or I was just vaguely aware of it, I guess. So it's complicated.
Right.
And for Eliade himself, the more you read him, yes, he knew this, but this was kind of the unspeakable secret, to use the phrase of my colleague Brian Rennie. He wasn't open about this. He coded this in his literary life for sure, but he tended to hide it or camouflage it in his scholarship. And so I think it's ambiguous and ambivalent, to be really honest about it.
This is a little excursion, but University of Chicago was the place where Hutchins was, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was the place where Leo Strauss worked.
Mm-hmm.
Leo Strauss, the great political philosopher, was a great influence on me. So Hutchins, who did the great books thing, and Leo Strauss and Eliade, they created for want of a better word, a conservative tradition of great books, the big thoughts, the kind of thing we're talking about, which in the period when you were there, were moving away from that into this materialist differences class stuff. So is that a correct reading of the larger picture or not?
Well, it's a slice of the larger picture. Yes. It's not inaccurate, but that bigger approach, or that I would call it a kind of intellectual capaciousness, was very much there as well. And I don't want to underestimate that. I picked that up, of course, in the culture, and there were other people there. I'm thinking of the anthropologist Richard Schwader, for example, who was there and very much was interested in these reality posits, but in a kind of intellectual capaciousness that could take it all in, as it were. And that's really what I've insisted on since then, is taking it all in and not shutting down, not shutting out any of these voices, whether you want to hear them or not. I mean, like, yeah, but these are human experiences too. These are voices too, and they deserve to be heard. Um, I don't know. I don't associate that with conservatism, but I can see where that's conservative by certainly by the postmodern standards that were coming in, that were problematic on other levels, I think.
I didn't mean conservative in the political sense.
No, I know you didn't. I
A
know.
lot of Leo Strauss's students turned out to be uh, politically conservative. I mean, there was a
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
cluster of them. So let's go on to uh, the the real meat of the book. These four figures, and chapter one is the book A Seance, Frederick Myers and the London Society for Psychical Research. Chapter two is Scattering the Seeds of a Superstory, Charles Fort and the Fantastic Narration of Western Occulture, meaning occult culture. Chapter three, The Future Technology of Folklore, Jacques Vallée and the UFO phenomenon, which we've both been fascinated by. Chapter four, Returning the Human Sciences to Consciousness, Bertrand Mehus and the Sociology of the Impossible. And then the conclusion will take us back on the page, and the eclipse of the sacred and the psyche in modern oblivion. Um, and then the very final part is called Impossible Disclosings, how you had a youthful encounter with UFOs and forgot all about it.
Right.
You're a very good storyteller, by the way. So, but let's start with the start. Who was Frederick Myers? What was the London Society for Psychical Research?
Well, this is part of the lineage, Michael. And, Fred, so first of all, we all studied William James and we all read William James in graduate school. And at least I assumed that the varieties of religious experience was sort of the definitive statement, and that he was interested in something called mysticism and pragmatism. And isn't it cool? Isn't he cool? What we were not told was that he was buddies with Frederick Myers, and that Frederick Myers himself was a philologist, was a classicist, an expert on ancient Greek thought and Roman thought, but was deeply involved in psychical research that came out of the spiritualist movement. And that not only Myers was trained at Cambridge and was very much a part of that whole circle, but there was a whole group of intellectuals. It wasn't just Myers, and so it was prominent. I mean, this is what British intellectuals were fascinated by and wanted to study, was essentially mediums and psychics, and so did William James, and so did early. And James created psychology and created a lot of American philosophy and was at the root of that. And so what I wanted to try to do with this chapter was show that actually these questions were at the root of both British and American intellectual life at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. And I think that's just obvious to anybody who looks at it. And it was Myers who really created a lot of these basic ideas like the liminal and the subliminal and the supernormal, and who really turned to evolutionary biology and evolutionary thought to think about psychical abilities. And I mean, this really lays the groundwork for a lot of these ideas. And it was a beautiful writer, by the way, himself. And his big book was not published till after he died, and was, by the way, heavily censored by his surviving wife as well, because Myers was in love with a woman who another woman who, by the way, was dead. She was a spectral presence or a ghost, and so I mean, again, the erotic returns, I think, in a really dramatic way, and is of course censored because it doesn't fit into our social values.
You start with two quotes. I love your quotes at the beginning of chapters and books, but one is from Edward Bulwer Lytton, and he says, "Now, my theory is that the supernatural is the impossible." He capitalizes both of them, and that what is called supernatural is only a something in the laws of nature of which we have hitherto been ignorant. And then the other quote is from Frederick Myers. "My history has been that of a soul struggling into the conviction of its own existence."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, those are beautiful thoughts or beautiful quotes. I love epigraphs too, Michael.
So Myers, uh, the British classicist and psychical researcher, as you said, first coined and theorized the term telepathy in 1882. So there wasn't a term before that.
Well, there were many terms, but not telepathy or not a now. This general move, as I try to explain in the introduction, this is a general move away from the category of the supernatural
Mhm.
because it implies some external deity kind of looking in, as it were, to a concept of the supernormal or the paranormal that it was called in French in 1903, which is more something emerging within this world that doesn't have a scientific model to it, doesn't behave according to these theistic principles. I think that's really where this is moving, or where this is going.
I'm going to read a few lines from this chapter. Myers also happened to believe, as he immediately explained to his readers, that there exists a kind of cosmic record or photograph of all that is thought and felt, and therefore his own whole past, quote, will probably lie open to those with whom I have to do, end quote. Here he is drawing on the precognitive and clairvoyant data of early psychical research, which can indeed suggest as much, particularly when it is read through the writings of one of Myers' most beloved classical authors, Plato. And then he says, you say, as explained in texts like Phaedo, whose study at 16 affected, for Myers, a kind of conversion. He explains that Plato taught that when the soul learns some profound truth, it is not creating or constructing this truth, but in fact remembering something it already knew in a pre-existent life, and so forth. Myers thought that certain forms of knowledge, mathematical, geometric, and poetic knowledge in particular, pre-exist their human discovery in other realms, and as such, it can be brought down into the world through the birth of a particularly gifted soul or genius. I mean, I just love this stuff, and it is, that's what I mean about how what you've done is to take a whole wide range of stuff that I've always been deeply drawn to. I've always felt I was far more a Platonist than an Aristotelian, and grounded it in a comprehensive, far reaching theory with an amazing range of reference that enables me to say, oh, yes, at the age of 82, all of my inclinations over the past 50 years or more are are actually something I can create coherence around.
Yeah, you remembered them.
I have remembered them. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, what more before we move on should we say about Myers?
Well, I think he's the source point. I mean, I think he originated. He even coined a lot of the words we still use today, and I think The thing, though, to remember, one of the other things to really grok about Frederick Myers is that, when we invoke evolution to talk about spiritual transformation, it goes back to Myers. I mean, he coined this word imaginal that he was really thinking of entomology, by the way, and that the study of bugs, and that there are these discs now that we talk about, these imaginal discs that exist in a larval form that will become the mature insect. And Myers felt that a lot of these psychical abilities like clairvoyance or precognition or telepathy were imaginal discs that would take shape and would become more fully formed in the future bug or the future insect that is the human being.
The subject of bugs is really interesting. I may have quoted to you before a essay by the great naturalist E.O. Wilson called "Is Mankind Suicidal?" in which he speculates that perhaps the Earth would have been better off if the dominant species had become some kind of giant ant.
Right.
But more than that, obviously, with a lot of the UFO experiences, people find themselves in the presence of a huge praying mantis.
Right. A big bug.
Right. And
Right.
so I wonder if you have associated, you may even have written about it, Myers' interest in etymology as a precognition of the centrality of bugs in cosmic evolution.
Yeah, I have actually. I mean, this idea of the perfect insect of the imaginal
Yeah.
is like, I mean, I've literally given lectures on that, and
Okay.
I think people think I'm nutty or I'm too out there, but I'm like, no, actually, this is actually what people see. I mean, this isn't me just being nutty. There's a lot of phenomenological or experience behind this claim.
Well, it makes perfect sense if you really think about it, but for the reasons E.O. Wilson is suggesting, which is that if if the world had been dominated by a giant ant, I mean, ant colonies are cohesive; they work together, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So once some species develops intellectual capacity, high intellectual capacity that enables them to manipulate their environment, uh, you would think that the trajectory of a praying mantis or an ant or something toward the capacity to create, long-term, eons of evolution would be far higher than that of a planet of angry apes, right?
Yeah. But yeah, and I think what's being reflected there is sort of our anxiety around personhood or individuality, where there's definitely a hive mind or a kind of communal groupthink that is in the bug or in the ant colony or in the bees, as it were. And I think that's what we're afraid of. And I think it comes up in like Star Trek's Borg, and I mean, it comes up in a lot of ways. And I don't know what to do with that anxiety other than just to say it's there. Clearly we're uncomfortable being an individual, and maybe that evolutionary impulse of becoming an individual is a dead end. Maybe, but maybe it's also profound. It's what makes us human.
Yeah, it could be very profound if we can make our way through it.
If we don't blow each other up or kill
Exactly.
each other. I mean, come on. I mean, this is really awful. This in a lot of ways, there's a lot of dangers here.
Yes, to say the least. So let's talk about the London Society for Psychical Research, both Myers and William James, and the centrality of that society to the recovering this lineage.
Well, again, I mean, again, the end of the 19th century, early 20th, that's like a major intellectual society. I mean, it still exists. It certainly doesn't have the cultural oomph that it once had. But that's where the lineage, I think, begins in some ways, and certainly is grounded in a really profound way for decades and for thousands and thousands of pages, you know.
One of the points you make is that, I mean, at one level, this is a very ancient tradition that whatever we want to call panpsychism, or the understanding in philosophy of mind, the understanding that consciousness is not a material excrudescence of the random evolution of the human brain, but rather is ubiquitous in the universe. And you can either take a Neoplatonic view that consciousness is primary and the material is a vibrational step down, or you prefer the non-dual monism that consciousness and materialism emerge from a single substrate, and our cognitive structure designed for survival and not for truth separates the two, but in fact they're one, right?
Yeah. And again, that's just, I like that model, Michael, but it's a model, and I'm not bound to it. I just think it's really useful and really helpful for a lot of these experiences. Um,
I mean, I think your embrace of it, and let me just ask you flat out, if you embraced the Neoplatonic model that consciousness is primary and the material is a vibrational step down, um, it's not in the current situation as strategic a position for you as a professor of history at Rice University as the dual aspect monism, which makes equal space for both.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I often say, I joke, I think I'm a Neoplatonist. That to me is the notion of the one and the many and the nous and being distant from the sun, and yet the rays of the sun participate in the sun. I mean, I do think that Neoplatonic option is a live one, and I think it's far better than what we're in right now. Um, do I think it's correct or the end point? No, but nothing is. Nothing is the end point. I think we're still in the process of working this thing out, and I don't think of course we can work it out with our clumsy words and our clumsy methods.
So when William James said he could not know whether it was the one or the many, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. I think it's, of course, both. Obviously, it's both are true on their own level.
You have an important segment of this chapter, the subliminal Gothic, the human as two. And because that idea, the human as two, is one of the most fundamental to you, perhaps you could explain why it comes up in the Myers chapter.
Yeah, well, because so what Myers felt is that a lot of these super normal abilities are functions of our bigger self, the subliminal self, and he wasn't denying that we have this social ego, that we're not Frederick Myers or Michael Lerner or somebody, but that's not all we are. And when these abilities spike, they're this bigger self that's trying to communicate with this smaller self, as it were. So to me, that's the human is too is crucial, because it allows us to model why these events happen, but it also, there's a kind of peace, Michael, with things are going to be fucked up. It's not going to go so well for the social self, but that's okay. That's part of the humanist too as well. And it also allows me, like, I'm at relative peace with things like university administration or our social lives that are a mess. But okay, they're a mess, but there's this bigger self in which they're not. Things don't exist. And so there's a kind of payoff for me there that I think is really real and really dramatic and really pragmatic, frankly.
You point out that Aldous Huxley, whose work we all know, had read his Myers, and listen to this, positioned Myers in his own psychological galaxy well above Freud and Jung, and put the same traumatic insight this way. Nothing in our everyday experience gives us any reason for supposing that water is made of hydrogen and oxygen, but when we subject water to certain drastic treatments, the nature of constituent elements become manifest. Similarly, nothing in our everyday experience gives us much reason for supposing the mind of a very average sensual man has, as one of its constituents, something resembling or identical with the reality, capital R, substantial to the manifold world. And yet, when that mind is subjected to drastic treatment, the divine element of which it is partly, at least partly composed, becomes manifest. So again, that's one of your central insights, is the impact of trauma,
Yeah.
which, by the way, from having done 229 week-long cancer help programs, I can attest to. That it breaks people into a greater reality.
It does.
Yeah.
Or it can.
It can.
Sometimes it just breaks people.
No, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. But that's very Huxley-ish. And what nobody seems to understand about Aldous Huxley is that, even with his perennialism, it's coming after the violence of World War II. I mean, he's a pacifist. And he knows darn well that war destroys people and is horrific, and so but he wants to affirm this divine ground as well. And I think both of those things are just patently obvious to him.
Am I remembering correctly that he also wrote the perennial philosophy?
Well, that's 1945 or 46.
Yeah, right after the war.
It's right after the war.
Right,
It's
right.
like, come on. I mean, perennialism and pacifism are at the core of him. And by the way, it's also Albert Einstein. It's like the same fusion of a kind of perennialism and a kind of pacifism that were just integrally related.
Right. Where was it that you give us that wonderful Einstein quote about those of us who study physics know that the idea of past, present, and future is a stubborn illusion?
Yeah, that's when his friend Michael Basso died. That's a famous, quote. It's in a letter, by the way.
Yeah. So there's so much power here. Another segment is called the supernormal and evolution. The world is too. So not only is the human being too, but the world is too.
Well, in our experience, obviously. I mean, this goes back to the question of is reality one or two, or one or multiple?
It's so beautiful, how Huxley calls this form of consciousness mind at large, and turned to the artifices of mescaline and LSD to become what he called an aspiring Gnostic. I mean, part of my problem reading you is I can't read you fast. And because you write so much, it takes me, at the beginning, I skimmed through all your books and I reached the point I was very proud of myself that on any book, I could give a little elevator speech about what the book was about,
Right.
But then I kept running into the fact that that was far from adequate, and that I just had to read each one carefully.
I think the books are rich because the lineage is rich.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's really the argument. It's like, oh my God, just read, just there's tons of this.
Yeah.
This is not minor.
Right. So now we come to this incredible guy in chapter 2, Scattering the Seeds of a Super Story, Charles Fort and the Fantastic Narrative of Western Occulture. So this is mind-blowing.
I love Charles Fort.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So tell us about Charles Fort.
Well, so I just finished this book. Not writing it, reading it. This is a joke, No, I didn't finish a book, right? I read it, and Christine Ferguson is her name. It's called Open Secrets, and she has this wonderful notion of what she calls journal culture, journal cultism, and basically what she argues is that a lot of the writers who made occultism popular were journalists. They were media people, and of course, she's absolutely right about that. And Charles Fort is one of her examples. And he not only did he write for newspapers, but his method was to go into the New York Public Library and read newspapers and journals back to 1800 looking for weird shit. And of course, he found a lot of it, but it was usually in a newspaper account or a journal article. And he's funny. He's hilarious. Oh my God, he's hilarious, Michael. You read his books. There's 4 big books that he's famous for, starting in 1919 and ending in 1932 when he died. And all of them are hilarious. And so his method is to propose an idea, but then to sort of make fun of it. And so you never quite know what he thinks or where he lands. And of course, he doesn't land in some way, but in other ways he does. And he's an American. He's writing in. He's a New Yorker. He's writing on the East Coast in the 1920s. Really is when he's writing 19 teens and 1920s and early 1930s.
What's really cool about Fort, among many other things, is that his legacy has survived with the Fortians. And, they're alive and well to this day. So there's this whole network of people who collect weird shit, right?
Well, but also his legacy in science fiction is like major. I mean, he's sort of the hidden inspiration behind a lot of American science fiction. So he's a genius but what makes him so powerful, and I'll tell you a funny story here, is that, there's a there. It's not just science fiction. It's like, there's like, he's really interested in the weird stuff that really happens. And the funny story is, what we can get to this when we talk about mutants and mystics, but I once was invited to a Comic-Con convention, and the basic idea of mutants and mystics is the superpowers are real, and nobody wanted to hear that. They just wanted to do their fantasy or pretend their cosplay or whatever. Nobody wanted to talk about superpowers as real. But Charles Fort did. This is the key I'm trying to go to. I think that was his power.
He and his wife, the couple lived in poverty for a good share of their life together. At one point, Charles was hawking all their belongings and breaking up chairs to heat the apartment until a wealthy uncle died and left him an inheritance that enabled them to live with relative comfort and peace. Yeah. But his literary talents drew attention, stunned worship, really, of the novelist Theodore Dreiser, who once described Fort in a letter to the writer as the most fascinating literary figure since Poe, and so on. And Buckminster Fuller, was an indirect fan. So it's not only science fiction and stuff. It's quite widespread, the appreciation of him.
Yeah, it's very widespread, certainly during his life. I mean, people haven't heard of him since, but unless you get into this, and then of course you run into him.
So Very important figure. We could go on for a long time about him, but we also want to get through the whole book in our time together. So the third person, here we come to someone that we both admire greatly, has been central to you, is Jacques Vallée, and it's called The Future Technology of Folklore, Jacques Vallée and the UFO Phenomenon. Tell us about Jacques Vallée.
So again, this is the book, by the way, that really is at the origin of my relationship to Jacques, because I think this is one of the only full essays thinking about him as a thinker. And of course, I was sharing this with Jacques in its various renditions, and he was reading it and responding to it. And his interest in the UFO phenomenon, by the way, is very Fortean. It was really Charles Fort who started to talk about these things. He called them super constructions in the sky. He, of course, didn't call them UFOs. That's a Cold War acronym. So, but Jacques is really kind of picking up on this sci-fi lineage and taking it in its own direction. And I'm trying to think about. I'm reading all of Jacques Vallée, by the way, for this essay, and kind of blown away by his fusion of what I would call the humanities and the sciences around esotericism in particular, and just really moved by the way he does it. And so I wrote this essay and spent a lot of time with Jacques around the essay. And this then becomes the origin of the Archives of the Impossible project and our archival collection at Rice. And I mean, this has a whole future to it that I think is really significant. We can talk about later. But that's really what this essay is about. And again, it's showing the thesis of the book, Michael. It's that when you write about someone or something in an existential way, the essay tends to take a life of its own, and it affects what it's about, essentially. And I think that's what this chapter did. It's not just about Jacques. It impacts Jacques' life and certainly my life in a really dramatic way.
Why don't you give us a kind of a capsule history of Vallée's life, since it's so central to this?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a lot of ways to talk about Jacques Vallée. I mean, so he's born at the end of World War II. He's born in I think he's born in 39, December of 39, I think is when he's born. He's born in Paris, and he grows up after the war, and he's an astronomer, but he's also reading about esotericism as well, and he's working in an astronomy observatory outside of Paris, and he gets really upset with the astronomers who are dismissing his mentor, Aimé Michel, who is trying to think about UFOs and Western culture in an integral kind of way, and he hears the astronomers dismissing this and is very upset. And he ends up he moves to the US, and he goes to UT Austin, and he helps NASA map Mars, with computers. And then he becomes a significant figure in the 60s. And he starts out with sort of this, what I call this nuts and bolts approach. He thinks of UFOs as some kind of spaceships from another star system, and that they're somehow canvassing or watching us. And then in 1968 or 69, he writes Passport to Magonia, and he breaks with this model and introduces folklore and the history of religions and the history of esotericism into the mix, and shows that there's a lot of similarity actually between what the UFOs are doing and what fairy folklore and the history of Islamic mysticism and the history of Christian mysticism. There's a lot of similarities between these stories. And he starts to play out this thesis in the 70s. And then he writes a book called The Invisible College. And he he introduces parapsychology into the mix even more, and remote viewing, and this then is taken up by a young film director named Steven Spielberg in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and kind of enters American culture through cinema, really, through that means. And so Vallée then becomes kind of the major voice in the UFO world, really in the 70s, and then in the 80s and 90s. He's engaged with the Soviet Union a lot, and he is working in Latin America a lot, and then he gets into medical technology, and he, by the way, he gets a PhD in computer science in 1969 or so at Northwestern, and becomes part of Project Blue Book in an unofficial capacity with J. Allen Hynek, who engages him as really a colleague. Jacques Vallée is really integral. He knows basically everyone in the UFO world from the early 1960s until today. And this essay is very much about that engagement from both a scientific perspective in terms of astronomy and physics and mathematics and computer science, but also from a humanistic or historical perspective through the history of esotericism and history of religions. And that's really what I was reading and what I was most taken with in the early decade of this millennium, and wrote this essay around that.
It's an extraordinary essay. He also co-authored a wonderful book called Wonders in the Sky, which is fabulous because it traces back all the different forms that these wonders in the sky have taken that were culturally appropriate to the cultures in which they appeared.
Yeah.
So he's tracing the UFO phenomenon back, not only through folklore, but also through their cultural appearance and all.
Yeah, there's really kind of two theories of the UFO in that world. One is that it's a post-1947 or post-Hiroshima, Nagasaki, post-atomic bomb phenomenon. And the other thesis is that it's ancient, and that what we think of as the UFO in the Cold War is really just a Cold War phenomenon. It's a Cold War story. And I think Jacques is much more, he sees relevance to both of those ideas, but he's much more in the camp of this is an ancient phenomenon that needs to be treated as such.
And he also is clear, is he not, that no one knows what these things are.
No.
And so he and you, if I have this correctly, I read a segment of one of his books where he says, it's as if something is training us to believe in these, but perhaps not too much, right?
Right. Yeah.
And he would like, just as you going back to the Plato's cave analogy, and you often say you want to get back into the projector booth and see who's putting stuff on the screen.
Yeah.
He has the same wish, right?
Well, that's Jacques' line, actually. He wants to look into the projector booth and see, what's doing the projecting. Yeah.
But more than that, isn't it true that, and I can't remember whether this is you or him, but I think it's you, that somebody's projecting all this stuff. We don't know who or what it is, but they're screwing with us.
Right.
In other words, it's not straightforward. It's not some great mystical light that just wants us to transform into, but they're tricky. They play with us. They screw with us. So do I have that right?
Yeah, no, that's me, of course, the phrase they're screwing with us. But I think it's faithful to Vallée in that he sees a kind of trickster element or a kind of riddle in the whole phenomena, and nobody does understand actually what's going on, because that's kind of the point,
Well, let's stay with that for a minute. Nobody knows what's going on, and that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
So your point of view, and above all, we're trying to understand your extraordinary work, is that something is writing us. We don't know what is writing us. But if we become aware that something is writing us, maybe we can come into a different relationship with whatever is writing us. And if we look at the data, the Fortean data, everything else, whatever is writing the world as we understand it is not straightforward. It's tricky.
Yeah.
It is, when Valais said, it's as though somebody, I remember his phrase, that it's like a reinforcement strategy. They appear in a temporal sequence that looks to him like a reinforcement strategy.
Yeah.
So someone or something, and he said he couldn't figure out what, is reinforcing a belief on us.
Yeah.
But not too much, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't want us. We're not necessarily going to get the reveal.
No, I don't think so.
Right.
But that itself is the reveal.
Right.
I end this book actually, and I go back to this scene a lot. It's Officer Shermer, actually. It's a Nebraska patrolman, and it's 1967. It's December 3rd. I mean, I just looked it up. I have a comic book of it actually. And in the sessions that involved hypnosis, in which he retrieved these memories of he meets this alien on the highway, and the alien says to him, "We want you to believe in us, but not too much."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's your line. And to me, that's wisdom. That's and of course, what the alien might be and what might be writing us is us. I often say that, and so but this is also the source of my notion of the humanist too, is this social ego or this form of consciousness, or Michael or Jeff, we're not going to understand this bigger self because we're not it, but we are it. We participate in it, but we're not identifying completely with it. And I'm okay with that. I think that's what I mean when I say it's the wisdom,
So you're fourth of the authors of The Impossible, who I had not heard about. Do you pronounce his name Bertrand Mayhust?
Mayu. Uh-huh.
Mayhew.
Uh-huh.
And returning the human sciences to consciousness.
Yeah.
And I'll start with the quote from him. No culture is able to achieve the integral fullness of the real, nor can any develop all the potentialities of the human being, for the latter is always in excess of itself. Each culture explores certain sectors of the real, privileges and develops certain dimensions of experience, and because of this, sacrifices other dimensions, other possibilities, which return to haunt it, and you use the word haunt quite frequently, which return to haunt it, the return of the repressed, ! Against which the culture projects itself through a number of mechanisms. And then you have a quote from Claude Lévi-Strauss, myths think themselves in man. So tell us about Bertrand Mayhew.
Well, so Bertrand is I guess a contemporary, maybe a slightly younger contemporary of Jacques. He lives in France and very much a French intellectual. And I probably read his book on flying saucers and science fiction first. It's all in French, by the way. All of his books are in French. And I just became enamored of his thought. He wrote a huge 2-volume history of mesmerism and animal magnetism for his dissertation at the Sorbonne, and that's published as well. And I read everything I could of Bertrand. Maybe by that time it was everything that was published anyway. And he struck me as he was saying similar things to what Jacques was saying. He was interested in the UFO. He was interested in parapsychology. He was interested in psychical research, and he was so embedded in what we call the social sciences or the humanities, that he was talking about all the people I knew and had read, and was relating them to these ideas. And I just became enamored. I still am enamored of Bertrand's thought. I think it's astonishing. And Bertrand never became part of the French academic scene in any professional or institutional sense. I think because of, the kind of radical secularism or flatland nature of French thought, frankly. So anyway, that's what that chapter was about. And it was about trying to lift up Bertrand and make him more known in an English-speaking world.
One of the major influences I'm reading you on Mayhews was the enigmatic spiritual teacher, ufologist, and mystical writer Aimé Michel,
Yeah.
who had the same powerful influence, or the same man who had such a powerful influence on Jacques Vallée.
Yeah.
And who in fact helped Mayhew find a publisher. But you've got this great capsule description of Aimé Michel, was a living paradox, a humpbacked dwarf of a man who suffered intensely throughout much of his life, wrote about his body as the machine. He thought in cosmic terms and looked upon humanity as a transitional species evolving toward a spiritual identification with the entire universe. His was both a deep and painful pessimism and a nearly limitless cosmic optimism.
Yeah. Yeah. That's Michel, or Aimé Michel. He also talked a lot about the surhuman, the superhuman, and very Nietzschean in I guess this way, but also very, very Roman Catholic in a lot of ways. Wrote for a magazine called Planète, which was very much in the zone in the 60s, and was writing about these very interfaces between the esoteric, the supernatural, the parapsychological, and the ufological.
Well, again, on each of these people, we could spend an hour, but staying with our need to complete in 90 minutes, I want to go on to the next section, which is the conclusion, called Back on the Page. So the first section, the introduction, was called Off the Page, and now you're coming back to Back on the Page. I'm going to start, I love your little introductions. This quote from Gershon Scholem: "For the mountain, the body of things, needs no key. It is only the nebulous wall of history which hangs around it that must be traversed. True history may at bottom be an illusion, but an illusion without which no perception of the essence is possible. The wondrous concave mirror of philological criticism makes it possible for people of today, first and most purely, to receive a glimpse in the legitimate orders of commentary of that mystical totality of the system, whose existence, however, vanishes in the very act of being projected onto historical time." So tell us about Back on the Page and the conclusion.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of Flatland, actually.
Right.
There's this two-dimensional page that we're spending most of the book off, in other dimensions, and thinking about those, and then we're returning to the page and returning to okay, well, so what do we do with all this, and how do we refashion theory and thought after these four authors of the impossible? Essentially, that's really what the conclusion is about, and I think we do that. We can do that, but it's tough. But it has something to do with neuroscience and has something to do with consciousness. And I cite these people, of course, and try to bring all this together. But the conclusion is just really a way of theorizing what we've learned. And the basic idea, Michael, if I can summarize it, is that when you have a paranormal event, what you really get is a story. You get a text, a form of writing, and therefore writing can become magical in a literal way. It can become paranormal because the paranormal expresses itself through language. Language itself can express and can affect the paranormal. And so what I'm trying to do is create this model of the paranormal as essentially language and as essentially communication, as essentially story, and arguing that there's something about story that is really key here, and that clearly we need a new story. We need a different story.
I think one of the central messages that you have is that but I'm trying this out, that those of us engaged in this quest can become authors of the impossible.
Yeah.
And that and this is the part I'm still struggling to understand completely, that by becoming aware of being authors of the impossible, we may begin to be able to be authors of ourselves. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate? So
yeah.
Could you expand on that piece? What does it mean when you've you have this thing about realization.
Yeah.
And then that's followed by authorization.
Correct.
And so realization is that you grok that this is what's going on, right?
Right.
And authorization is that what?
Well, so realization can be temporary. It can be these moments. It can be these moments of synchronicity, or this encounter with a dead loved one, or this encounter with a UFO. There's this grokking that somehow this is me. Somehow I'm projecting this, or I'm the observer. I'm the form that's really expressing itself. Authorization is when you take that insight and you make it much more systematic, like you and I are doing here, or like I'm doing in the book. You're saying, look, this is what it's about, and we need to theorize this and think about this so that we can better author ourselves, like in terms of our politics, in terms of our legal systems, in terms of our religious beliefs, in terms of our spiritualities. How can we do this better? And it's where I break down, Michael, and that I'm not a religious leader. I'm not a political activist. I'm no good at doing stuff. I think what I'm good at is taking things apart and putting them back together and saying, here's what we should do. But then when you say, okay, Jeff, here's what we should do. Well, how do we do it? I'm like, I don't know. So I guess that's really kind of the authorization part, is where I get a little bit fuzzy, Michael. So your fuzziness is because of my fuzziness, is what I'm trying to say.
That's helpful. So let's just spend the next 12 minutes or so kind of contextualizing all of this. I have said to you that, this exploration of consciousness, which I began to fully dedicate myself to, 4 years ago. Actually, it started, as I've said to you, when I ran across the book Children Who Remember Past Lives. And I had read it before, but I hadn't been ready for that to say yes, this is true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ian Stevenson's work and then his successor. And then when I said, yes, this is true, then came flooding in, if this is true, what about all the other psi phenomena? Intuition, telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, remote viewing, near-death experiences, and so on. And so that became coherent. Simultaneously, I was exploring the UFO literature, and then I found your work. And that's what wrapped it all together for me. So now I walk around every day with a completely different experience of myself and everything I'm encountering. Right?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So, but I'm not someone who experiences except occasionally. I had severe gout a few weeks ago and I overdosed on a CBD thing. And, I actually had CBD THC pain thing, and because you don't like to have accidental trips. The set and setting isn't right?
Right.
But
Right.
because I was reading your work, I was able to say to myself, okay, this is happening and I can stabilize this. And I was able to stabilize it. And fascinatingly, I saw what I was seeing as a television screen with that static when nothing's on it. And then different things would flash onto the screen. And I was able to navigate this unexpected and unwanted trip so that when I had the experience of cosmic consciousness, which was very real, I could be with that. But then when I started going down rabbit holes, I could pull myself back.
So that's authorization. That's
Right.
it. That's it. And what it reminds me of, Michael, is so I have this friend, this colleague named Peter Shoshet Hughes, which if you haven't read, you'll want to read him. He's a philosopher and he writes about the philosophy of psychedelics, by the way. And basically what he says, if I can put Peter in a few words, you better darn well study some metaphysics before you take psychedelics, because you're going to have metaphysical experiences. And if you don't know what to do with them, that's a problem. If you do know what to do with them, then you can do it, and to me, that's authorization as well. It's like, absolutely. But you better darn well study the philosophy. You better darn well know your literature before you go into that, because you're going to be less a human being and you're going to have a more confusing set of experiences if you don't. So, and it's not that it solves it or it makes it easy or it takes away all the challenge. That's not it at all. But something is won or something is gained by that learning process, I think.
One of the most fascinating things that you talk about is that whatever it is that is projecting whatever images we see on our screen, it behaves according to the cultural or personal preconceptions of the time. In other words, those preconceptions or cultural things affect the way it works.
Yeah.
It works differently in different cultures and different times and for different individuals.
Yeah. I think that's true.
Someone said to me, perhaps we die into what we believe. Did you say that to me?
I use the phrase "we die into our imaginations."
Right.
Yeah,
Well, that's
and
pretty fascinating.
yeah, and where I was hesitating before, inside was this notion of authorization. I mean, you're maybe by slotting the experience into a model, you're also limiting it in some ways, and you're also slotting it into a culturally syntonic or a culturally relevant model. But maybe it's not that. Maybe it's more than that too. And so this gets into the same question. But that I do think the phenomenon presents itself including in our own experience, according to how we imagine that it's going to be. I do think that.
Any last thoughts? Again, let's go back to the beginning. This is, for you, your most important text of the 13 books you've written, although a 14th is complete, and I'm looking forward to reading that. You were kind enough to send it to me. But this is a central point in the trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, so this 14th book you spoke about, and all the books that all come after this, they're all sort of, this is the secret, I think. This is the core, that there is a super story, that it is about writing, that it is about storytelling, that it's us. It's us. And the other books are explanations or explications of these basic ideas. That's how I would put it, Michael. That's why I love this book and say it's the most important, because it's sort of the core of the idea that then gets explained in different ways in the later books.
You know, I keep coming back, as I've told you in email correspondence, to your autobiographical book, The Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions, and coming back to your appendix on the gnomons, or the maxims. And as you know, you have 20 of them. We've talked about them before. And what I found myself doing, Jeff, was trying to reorder them, because here you give them in the sequence in which they came to you. So, you know, you start with heretical heterosexuality, whereas male heteroerotic forms of the mystical generally become heterodox or heretical. Sublimated male homoerotic forms generally become orthodox. And then you go to the humanist too, the erotic mystic, the amoral or transmoral mystic, and so on. But the punchline is the 20th. The new sacred, consciousness as such, is the new sacred. So what I've been trying to do, without complete success, is to reorder them in a more, I don't want to say hierarchical, but starting with number 20, that consciousness is the new sacred, and then working through what you came to finally as a way of structuring it, not in terms of your evolution, but in terms of your core message.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I certainly didn't mean or didn't intend the gnomons in any kind of. I mean, they are organized autobiographically, as you mentioned, but there are no doubt some that are more primary than the others. But I just haven't thought that. I mean, I haven't thought like that, Michael, to be blunt about it. But it seems right to me. It seems absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so where this trilogy, I'm working on this trilogy now, where I keep saying it's going is towards idealism, and that's the consciousness as such. You know, I really do think that that's kind of where you end up, or where one lands is some form of idealism,
Mm-hmm.
And there are different forms of that, of course. I don't mean that naively, but that's the new sacred is consciousness as such.
Well, Jeffrey Kripal, our next conversation is going to be about a remarkable book, which I wasn't drawn to at first, but I became a huge fan of because I'm not into comics: Mutants and Mystics, Science Fiction, Superhero Comics, and the Paranormal. And
yeah, there it is. There's on my wall too.
Illustrated, and an extraordinary book. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, let's talk about popular culture. I mean, that's really and class and the parent. I mean, that'll get us into a lot of this stuff. I think it's really.
Jeff, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Don't take it, 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 don't is a sink. The river knows no end, and the river feels no